Okay. Good morning, councillors. Good morning, officers. Welcome back after summer vacations. I hope you're all well refreshed. You can probably hear from my voice this morning. It's a bit on the edge. A number of reasons for that I won't go into, but let's just say I refrained from singing karaoke last night because it would have tipped me over. So as Councillor Blakeborough isn't here as our deputy, would you be happy to propose another deputy chair to sit in for this particular meeting, just in case my voice does go? Yes, Councillor Davis. Councillor Feakins, everyone happy with that? Great. Okay, thank you very much. Before we go into the agenda itself, can I just go across the top table and then across the officers' table just to give introductions? So I'm Councillor Paul Pavia and I'm Chair of Economic Development. If we go to my right.
Paula Harris, Scrutiny.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Matt Feakins, Deputy Chair.
Rachel Lewis, Planning Policy Manager.
Mark Hand, Head of Planning, Housing and Place Shaping.
Mark Howcroft, Assistant Head of Finance.
Kelly Byrne, Enterprise.
Councillor Jez Becker, Committee Member.
Brian Strong, Committee Member.
David Dovey, Committee Member.
Alan Davis, Committee Member.
Richard Roden, Committee Member.
Councillor Val Smith, Observing.
Councillor Sarah Jones, Cabinet Member for Social Justice, Observing.
Philip Thomas, Development Services Manager.
Thank you all very much, and obviously warm welcome to our observers here today for this particular meeting. So if we go for item number 1, apologies for absence. Do you have any apologies?
Just one apology, Chair, from Councillor Blakeborough.
Okay, thank you very much. And I believe Councillor Peter Clark has also given his apologies as well. Item 2, declarations of interest on the agenda. Is anyone got particular want to raise a declaration now? No. Yeah, so that's fine. Obviously, make sure you sign your paperwork as appropriate. Agenda item 3, public open forum. I don't believe there's anyone from the public here this morning to undertake that particular item. So we go on to item number 4, to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting. Let's take them on block for accuracy. Are there any issues members would like to raise? Or would you like me to go through page by page, or should we go through page by page? Yeah.
I'll go through minutes.
Move. Okay. Everyone happy with that proposal? Okay. Thank you, Councillor Feakins. So, item number 5. This is probably the big ticket item today. The Monmouthshire Local Development Plan Annual Monitoring Report. Before I hand over to Mark, this is an incredibly important piece of work for the council coming up. I'm sure you're well aware of the LDP review that's coming up, and it's an important piece of work for us as well as a scrutiny committee. We've got our scrutiny strategic workshop in October, just a few weeks away, and this is going to certainly form an important part of that workshop session as we look to develop our plans for the next year and the next 5 years as a committee. So if I hand over to Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much, Chair. If it's okay with yourselves, Rachel and I do a bit of double act and take you through the key points with a presentation. Let's try and get that back up on the screen. Okay, so we'll go through some of the context of what the AMR is, because I appreciate some of you have been on planning committee or the select committee in the past, so we'll know some of this, but others haven't. And then we'll go through the highlights and next steps through bits that are in the report. We're just picking out the main parts for you. So the annual monitoring report is a statutory requirement, as the name suggests. We have to do it every year since plan adoption, which was 2014. So this is the third one we've done. We have to submit it to the Welsh Government by the end of October. And we've always in Monmouthshire brought it through the E&D Select Committee just to present an update of what's happening with the plan, because it is, as Chair said, an important topic for the county. One of the challenges of these reports is always that it's last financial year, so it's always a bit weird to read and write, because some of you will know that things have moved on in terms of permissions or success on sites from what's actually in there, but that's the context to it. So the point of the AMR is to monitor how effectively the LDP is working. So the plan strategy, the objectives, and the site allocations, are they being achieved and functioning effectively, or have we got areas for concern? And then the results from that are used to see whether there's any revisions to the plan that are necessary. And it also allows us to look at the impact the LDP and the associated planning decisions are having on the social, economic and environmental wellbeing of the county. And at the start of the report, we also have to look at whether there's any significant contextual changes that may influence the plan going forward. So either kind of physical or economic things in the county, or new legislation, or new policy from the Welsh Government, or otherwise. So the report set out, it goes through indicators, traffic lights them in a fairly simple way. So if they're green, we're happy that the targets or the monitoring outcomes are being achieved. If they're amber, it's likely that they're not being achieved, but for various reasons we don't have actual concerns about the policy itself. You know, things will come good in a bit of time. It's the red ones that we really need to keep an eye on, and there's 8 of those in this year's report, and they're the ones where the targets or the monitoring outcomes are not being achieved, and we have concerns either about catching up or about how those policies are working. So what we propose to do, Chair, is go through the green rated ones first, which Rachel will cover, and then because there are some success stories in there which are worth talking about, and then we'll spend a bit more time on the red rated ones, key findings and next steps.
Thanks, Mark. Excuse my voice as well. I've also got a sore throat. So in terms of the green indicators, strategy and housing, progress continues to be made towards the implementation of the spatial strategy. We approved a total of 484 dwelling units during the last monitoring period, of which 93 were for affordable homes. 4 of the LDP allocated sites have gained permission. The former paper mill at Sudbrook, Coed Glass in Abergavenny, and 2 of the main village sites at Penholt and Shire Newton. But it's also worth noting that significant progress has also been made in relation to 3 other strategic housing sites at Derry Farm, Fairfield Maybe and Rockfield Farm. Affordable housing policy targets set out in S4 are also generally being met in relation to permissions granted in the main towns and the main villages. Moving on to economy and enterprise, we have a total of 40.76 hectares of employment land available. So there's plenty of land to meet the identified take-up rate of 1.9 hectares per annum. Take-up stood at 3.21 hectares, which was mainly attributable to development at Mega Brewery and also Westgate Business Park. There was also some take-up on the protected employment sites at Union Road, Abergavenny and Mega Brewery. There's also been a number of employment permissions in the county for B-use class employment uses on SA1 sites, SA2 sites, totaling 2.26 hectares, and also a number of rural diversification schemes. Good news on the tourism front as well. We've approved a total of 24 tourism facilities, all of which related to tourist accommodation, so from holiday lets to glamping. So it sort of demonstrates that the draft SPG on sustainable tourism accommodation is moving in the right direction and enabling those sorts of developments to come forward. Excuse me. Retail and community facilities, vacancy rates in all of the shopping areas are below the Wales average, which is 15.2% at December last year. All but one, which is us, were below the national average as well, which stood at 12.2% in December last year. The proportion of A1 retail units within the primary shopping frontages generally accord with those set out in the SPG, which is good news. And 4 community and recreation facilities were also granted permission. In terms of the environment, considerable increase in development permitted on brownfield land, 51.2%, which is really significant for Monmouthshire. There's been no loss of listed buildings or historic sites, and no development permitted which would adversely impact on the historic environment. Progress is being made towards waste management capacity for the LDP, and importantly there's been no reduction in the minerals land bank. And a total of 5 schemes incorporating on-site renewable energy generation were permitted as well. And no developments in C1, C2 floodplains, which didn't meet Town 15 tests set out in national guidance. So that's a quick run through of the positives. I'll hand you over to Mark to go through the less favourable indicators.
Thanks, Chair. So there are some really good news bits in that. Probably some of the bits you heard, perhaps when you're canvassing, or just generally as ward members, there's quite often a perception that the only thing that's happening in the county is house building, and none of the infrastructure or jobs to go with that is coming forward. But the evidence from that actually suggests that isn't entirely true, and we certainly have a lot of employment land allocated for the jobs, and that infrastructure to come forward as well, with quite a lot of permissions last year. In terms of the challenging ones, there's 8 indicators that are red in our assessments. So as I mentioned, we're not going to go through all the amber ones as well. They're set out on the report with the explanations as to why we think they're not red. The key ones relate to housing delivery and completion. So in terms of completions, there's only 238 completions, which is both market housing and affordable, during the current monitoring periods. To give a bit of context, the plan in its totality allocates land for 4,950 homes, but the need, you have need, which is 4,500, and then a bit of flexibility, just in case, the 10%. To achieve that, if you just divide the plan fairly crudely, the 4,500 over 10 years, we should be doing 450 a year. So we're significantly below that. In fact, though, the plan was adopted in 2014. The 3 years before that also count because they're within the plan period, and completions then were even lower again. So what we need to be achieving at the moment is 488 completions per year. And we're on 238 this year. That's a similar pattern to previous years, and historically we've never been anywhere near 488. So it's a challenging target in the first place. There's all kinds of reasons why the sites aren't coming forward as quickly as we'd like, many of which are beyond our control, but this is the way in which we're measured. And at the end of the day, we can have all kinds of arguments why things aren't happening, but what actually matters to the communities and the people trying to get housing is if it exists on the ground. And that's the challenge around this area. So there's a fairly hefty shortfall over the plan since adoption of 797 dwelling completions, with only 667 completed to date. So you'll have heard us talk about our 5-year housing land supply, which I'll come to in a second. Directly linked with that is a challenge around affordable housing completions, which we have a separate indicator for. The target in the plan is for 960 in the plan period. So again, dividing that between the 10 years, we should be doing 96 a year. Last year we achieved 47, similar pattern in previous years. In fact, fewer in some of the previous years. So yeah, to date, since adoption, there's only 127 completions of affordable housing, so it's 161 below. It's worth noting probably that if you look at those proportionately, completions in total we've achieved about 45% of what the target was since plan adoption, and affordable housing is 44%. So although those of you, particularly on planning committee, will be familiar with us talking about site viability and those challenges, the direct correlations also that if the houses just aren't being built, then we're not getting the affordable that goes with it either. So I think it's the total of the picture that really needs our attention. Again, directly linked with that is our land supply. We should have a minimum of 5-year deliverable land supply, and the way in which this is measured looks at sites that are allocated in the LDP or have an extant planning permission, and we go through a process with development industry and the actual applicants looking at how many homes will be built each year over the next 5 years, and then that's ratified by an independent planning inspector. So we've just had our result through in the summer for the situation as at April 2017, and we've got a 4-year land supply. So most of you will have heard us talking about the need for taking a pragmatic approach with unallocated sites. Again, I won't bore you with the details. There's some challenges and disagreements with the actual way this is calculated from a council point of view. The development industry thinks this is the right way. There used to be a way of calculating it against past build rates. So you just measure yourself against what's always happened. And if we did that, we'd have something in the region of a 10-year supply. There's challenges around both arguments. The way it is measured now means that we're factoring in an awful lot of issues that aren't within our remit. So external economic factors affect how quickly builders are building, either positively or negatively, which we can't do much about most of those. Conversely, the past build rates methods, understandably, the development industry didn't like that because it gave a slightly skewed figure. If we starve the market consciously, you end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy. Only 10 houses being built, therefore your foregoing need is 10 houses per year, which is an equally bonkers conclusion. So there's challenges around the way it was. There's challenges the way it is measured now. But it is what it is to a large extent, and the other evidence shows we've got some problems there. A bit of information behind that, I guess, is around our strategic housing sites. So there's been limited progress with those coming forward. Initially, when the plan was adopted, we envisaged that all of those would have consent by the end of 2014, which clearly hasn't been the case. Within this plan period, as Rachel mentioned earlier, only the paper mill site in Sudbrook and Wannistow Road site in Monmouth have planning permission and are on site. The Sudbrook one's doing site clearance. The others are at different stages in the pipeline. So I've got a bit of a slide just setting out where we are with each of those. Derry Farm, which is 250 dwellings, that should be coming before planning committee in October. Obviously those on planning committee, make sure you keep your powder dry in anything you say later, but that'll be coming before you. There's been some challenges around that in terms of both viability and a solution to undergrounding the pylons, which has added some very significant costs to developing the site, but we're comfortable with there now as officers, and we're hoping that's coming before October planning committee. Crick Roads, 285 dwellings. It's on there, I flagged it as red with no planning application. Behind the scenes, there's an awful lot of work gone on, and there's reports coming to Cabinet in the near future, looking at the way in which we bring that site forward, and we are expecting a planning application this financial year. But as things stand, there's no planning permission for that site. The Maybe Bridge site, outline planning permission as a committee resolution this financial year for 450 dwellings. We haven't actually signed the Section 106 planning agreement yet, so that's on there as amber, but there's a lot of progress being made on that one. So next year that should be a far better story, but clearly it's behind in terms of time. So the number of homes that will be delivered within this plan period by 2021 is significantly affected. Wannistow Road, I mentioned, there's 340 dwellings have permission, they're under construction, but the remaining 140 or so is effectively landlocked, and until a current developer puts in an access road, they can't build on it. So that's likely to happen in 2020, but we've got no planning application for that bit of land at the moment. Rockfield Farm, marked as Amber's, 270 dwellings. That's one in council ownership as well. That's been through the planning process with an outline application, having committee resolution. That's awaiting now the legal agreement around the planning contributions. So again, next AMR, that should be much better news, but time-wise, we're behind. Vinegar Hill, no progress whatsoever. It's 225 dwellings, no planning application. The party involved in that is saying they're waiting to see what happens with the M4 Relief Road and some of the compulsory purchase on their land, none of which seems to be insurmountable to my opinion. But in terms of any real activity, nothing's happened. And then last but not least, Sudbrook Mill, as I mentioned, that's got permission, detailed planning permission, site clearance is ongoing, and we're just trying to resolve a Welsh water infrastructure capacity issue at the moment, but they should be on site in December, but again behind time-wise where we'd like to be. So in terms of conclusions, I'll pass back to Rachel.
Thanks, Mark. So I think it's fair to say that good progress continues in terms of implementing many of the plan's policies, and overall the strategy remains sound, but as Mark's just pointed out, a number of the key housing provision policy targets are not being met, and the policies aren't functioning as intended. And importantly, the continued lack of a 5-year land supply remains a matter of concern that needs to be addressed if our housing requirements are to be met. So in view of that, the position remains, as with last year's AMR, that an early review of the LDP is necessary to address a housing land supply shortfall. So the AMR recommends to continue with an early review of the LDP to address the shortfall in the land supply and to facilitate the identification of additional housing land. This is going to involve the production of a review report, which will set out and explain the scope of the plan revision required, which Mark will touch on in the next slide. Secondly, to submit the third AMR to the Welsh Government by the end of October, and to continue to monitor the plan through the preparation of successive AMRs. So Mark will run through the next steps in the process.
Yeah, so thanks, Chair. So a mixture of good news and some challenges. As you'll see in the report, we're recommending we need to crack on with this early revision of the LDP. So in terms of next steps, the first thing that we have to do, as Rachel mentioned, is a review report. This third AMR is a start of that process, and it's gathering together all of the evidence to see how the plan is delivering, what in the context has changed. And that concludes with a recommendation of how we go forward. That'll come through political reporting cycle. We're hoping later this calendar year, and then we can get political approval and crack on. So that will have to look at where changes are required in the plan based on evidence. So in terms of revising the plan, there's a couple of options. The first is that we can do something called a short form revision. That would effectively just look at amending the part of the plan that we think isn't working. So in this instance, it would be around the housing land supply. You'd keep the strategy of the plan, which focuses development on Chepstow, Abergavenny, Monmouth, and Sevenside. That strategy would remain, but you'd just look at, really in this case, we think the housing issue. In a theoretical world, that has a lot of advantages, especially if we're moving towards a system of regional planning in South East Wales, with a strategic plan, and then a local plan sitting underneath that. However, the advice from Welsh Government at the moment seems to be this methodology isn't suitable in our circumstances, or in most circumstances, it seems. So we think that one's potentially going to be a challenge, but we'll get the evidence on that and come back to you. The alternative is that we do a full form revision, which is essentially a brand new LDP. So that means we look at the strategy of the plan again, where we focus development, and all those wider issues. So it's more work and potentially more of a challenge, I guess, but it does mean we can look at all of those aspects. So there'll be other aspects we can consider, things like employment land. We've got plenty of land at the moment, but we can look at whether that's in the right place, serving the right kind of industries coming forwards as things progress, and look at some of the challenges around why those sites haven't come forwards. Again, we don't think that's completely broken at the moment, but if we did a full plan revision, we can look at that, and we can also look at all kinds of things. Again, strategy is our way of delivering the housing the best way we can do in the future. Should we look at all kinds of different options? A new settlement potentially being one of them. Is that a way of delivering longer term some of our housing needs in a better fashion? So we'll be looking at all of those options if we went down the full form revision route. And a lot of that links directly in with some of the work around future Monmouthshire, where we're going as a county. Do we look at doing things in a different way, going for growth, ways of sustaining some of our more rural communities, but equally having to balance up the landscape beauty of the county and the things that are important. So that's nowhere near a conclusion yet. That will come before yourselves as members for a decision on which way we go. There is a bit of a third option loitering in the background, which is potentially that we pause everything and wait for a regional plan, and then pick up a local development plan after that. My advice at the moment is there's some fairly big risks around that based on what we currently think, because potentially we'd have a gap with no local development plan at all. The regulations in place now mean that as of the 1st of January 2022, we'd have no development plan, because it has an expiry date. This is something new, something we've never had in the past. In the past, you might have heard us talk about having an out-of-date plan, but it still is a policy framework until the new plan comes along. But the new regs mean the plan has an expiry date, and after that we have no development plan at all, just national planning policy. Potentially would have a gap then between 2022 and round about 2024 before we have an SDP, and then until 2026 roughly until we have a new LDP for Monmouthshire. So we need to rethink really carefully around those risks. I suspect we'll be recommending that we crack on with a LDP for ourselves as Monmouthshire, and don't wait for the SDP. But we'll come to that conclusion or recommendation as officers in due course, and talk more to that in the future. So the last bit from us, Chair, is just the recommendation for this select committee, is really to note the comments of the AMR, understanding that the next step is this review report, which will come before members for consideration, and we submit the AMR to the Welsh Government, but we're open to any discussion or comments around what we've said. One really brief comment, if I may. We spotted a minor error on page 25 of the AMR, the paper copy, which is just a typo in terms of numbers. So we'll correct that on our submission. It doesn't change any of the conclusions, but it's around dwelling completions in rural areas. We talk about there being 23 general market completions, but it's actually 33. We just spotted that the numbers didn't add up. We'd lost 10 somewhere. So it doesn't change any of the conclusions or findings, just a typo, but just to bring that to a committee's attention. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rachel, for that detailed analysis. I know councillors have got a range of questions they want to ask on the report. Can I just remind councillors to use their microphones when they ask the questions, and obviously switch off so we can hand over to the officers to respond. Can I start with Councillor Becker? You wanna?
Certainly can. Thanks, Chair. A couple of questions just coming up from what you've said. For a short form review, in the officers' opinions, would something like that actually take into account the wider problems of the Severn Bridge toll coming down? Would you be able to adapt an LDP with such large issues? I mean, would a short form review basically be adequate to our purposes?
I think it probably could be. Yeah, we'd have to give that some more thought. But I mean, the challenge that's going to bring, as I understand it, will just or be an increased housing pressure, particularly in the south of the county. We already know the challenge that we're primarily facing is around housing land. So it would be tackling, the issues surrounding that, but it's obviously going to increase the magnitude of that challenge and how we deal with it. So I think theoretically, yes, it could, but it would have to be in the context of the current plan strategy, which is where we're focusing developments. If we wanted to do something different in terms of a strategy, it would need a full-blown LDP review. But that is one of the contextual changes we'll have to be mindful of going forward, and a pretty significant one for our county. Really briefly, I don't know if you've seen the article on the BBC Wales website this morning, but it touches on that very clearly, talks about our average house price. I'm sure it says we're the highest average house price in Wales now, which we were trying to have a sanity check against whether that would be true with Cardiff, but we think it probably would be. So that is a very clear challenge. And then obviously the average house price affects who can get on the market. Affordability becomes a bigger challenge for us, and so on and so on.
I think that's a really good question, Councillor Becker, and it was the first question that I asked of Mark. So planning is just an enabling framework, isn't it? The planning system is really important. It creates the infrastructure for our county, but it's there to support economic growth, to support education, thriving communities, the well-being, the very fabric of our whole county. And I think the difficult thing for us at this time is it's quite clear that the current plan isn't fit for future purpose. Okay, it's delivering outputs and outcomes which are important now, but today isn't the issue, tomorrow is, and it's about, what we're playing into, not just the bridge tolls, but if you think about our regional context, now we operate within a city deal, a city region context. And the difficulty is that with the guidance changes and the probable move to a strategic development plan for the region, we could hold out and we could say we'll do a full-blown review of our own plan, which would take time. In the meantime, with the burgeoning regional activity, I don't want us to be in a position where we have top-down targets imposed by the region. And, sometimes the perception is this is sleepy old Monmouthshire. They're market towns, they're pretty, they're great for tourism and heritage, but they're not engine rooms of growth. And I think we've got to strike the balance with thinking about that long-term strategy, thinking about the purpose of our county and the role and contribution we could make and play, but doing that quick enough so we get a foothold in actually shaping and informing a regional strategy and not being directed by it. So that's the very, very difficult balance that we have to strike at this time. So yes, it may be that we start out, Mark, with a partial review. We have to get some things underway in order to set that context. But the challenge for me, absolutely here, isn't a planning one. That's one of the tools that we can use to respond to the challenge. The big challenge for me has to be the economic one. Because at this time, Monmouthshire's economy is relatively competitive. It's the second most competitive place in the whole of Wales. It's about 160 out of 400 local authority areas in the UK. So it's doing okay, but it's not good enough given the opportunities that we have. So with the bridge tolls, with opportunities for tidal lagoon power, the knowledge sector is one of the fastest growing industries in our county. We've got to do something radically different because you've seen the demography, you've seen that our ageing population is rapidly increasing, not just those aged over 65, but those aged over 85, 132% increase. That's what we're going to see. While simultaneously, my big fear is that we're going to lose our young people, and that's the thing that we absolutely must address. That's the tide that we need to sort of stem, and I think for us that is the big challenge, and we have to try and use and leverage the planning system to the best of our ability to be able to address some of these things. So as important as the planning system is, it is there as an enabling tool to solve some of the really big problems that we face as a county.
Thanks, Kelly. Did you come back on that, Councillor Becker?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I mean, that's kind of what I was driving at there. We require a certain amount of flexibility, which a full-blown review would take a lot of time, and a short-form review doesn't necessarily allow us to have the correct economic criteria for planning, because we've got this. We're happy with the amount of employment land, but where is that employment land? How is that employment land actually servicing our aspirations economically as a county? There are elements in the LDP, such as the 25% affordable housing in the Sevenside area. Now, with the bridge tolls coming down, should we actually be looking to up that 35% in line with the rest of the county? Or is 35% of housing actually putting off house builders from building houses in areas that we would serve with the correct kind of economic growth and employment area? So there is an economic environment which I don't think the current LDP is really, it's going by the numbers and not really taking a notice of the environment of our county. And our county is defined a lot by its geography, not only by its rurality in some places, but also its lack of a rail system that goes across the middle through Raglan. These are elements we need to look a bit more qualitatively, I think, than the LDP currently allows, at where we want to build. It's not just a case of let's chase the numbers of house building. It's about, are we building the right kind of numbers for the right kind of industries to support the right kind of people? Otherwise, we're going to end up with houses in places which are simply island agglomerations where none of the wealth generation of the people who live there comes back to our community. It's all exported to outlying commuter areas. So it does seem like it's not quite up for it. I would be interested in knowing if anybody's talked about the suitability of the 25% affordable rule as it pertains to Sevenside, what with the bridge tolls coming down and the M4 changes.
Thanks, Chair. I'd echo both the comments from Kelly and Councillor Becker. I think the plan is very much this framework to deliver what we need. But I think going forward in terms of the review and the next LDP, whatever form that takes, it is having that challenging question as a council of what are we aiming for. Arguably in the past, we've probably gone for, I think we went for middle range of growth. But we haven't gone for some kind of growth aspiration or significant changes that we're looking at some of those challenges of future Monmouthshire and how we achieve some of those objectives. So I think there's a load of those discussions that we really need to have. And I understand it's a challenge for all of us, challenge for us as officers. But as members, collectively, it's easy for you potentially to agree for a growth strategy. But when you start drawing red lines around fields in your wards, it becomes a much bigger challenge. But we've got to get, I guess, beyond that really as a county and look at where we're going and what we want to do, and that demographic challenge that Kelly talked about. Employment land, we absolutely, if we're doing, it's when we're doing a new LDP, because there will be one eventually, whether we do it in this next stage or later. I'm trying to avoid committing myself at the moment until we've got all the information, but I do have a preference at the moment of what I think we should do. We've got to look at all of that. We've got to look at the industries that we need to support and where. The affordable housing is always a challenge, and those on planning committee will be used to this debate we keep having. The 25% in the southern bit of the county and the 35% in the north is based on viability evidence from the last LDP. So again, that can be reviewed. The figures are showing that we're consistently getting around about 19%. The previous plan target was 20%. And the anecdotal evidence from the office always seemed to be that we used to get that and it wasn't a problem. But then equally, the economic situation has changed since that past plan. And I'm also mindful saying that, that doesn't mean the solution should be the next plan. The target's 20% because we always got it and that was successful. Because in Wannistow Road, we got 30%. And if we had a target of 20%, we would have got 20%. The added argument around all of that is around the way viability works. And we are in a system that isn't working as well as it should, in my opinion. There's a whole argument around land values. In a very black and white theoretical scenario, land should be worth what it's worth once you take off build costs, developer profit, our Section 106 requirements, affordable housing, and those factors, with a bit of an uplift, would accept a landowner needs an incentive to actually part with their land. That isn't how it's working in practice. But again, that is a bit of a cycle we're locked into, and how we get out of that is a bigger challenge than Monmouthshire. So as much as bridge tolls mean house prices are going up, it also means land values are going up. The construction industry, we're having all kinds of people talk to us at the moment, saying that's the biggest challenge for them. There's not enough brickies, sparkies, chippies, any of those industries, so they're putting their prices up because they're massively in demand, which pushes up build costs. So yeah, there's some real challenges in the whole system, which will probably become more challenging when the bridge tolls really do change. At the moment, it's everyone's working on the ambition of it happening and the promise that it will happen, but it's, you know, when it really does happen, we'll see what those impacts are. But again, the BBC article's given some information from estate agents in the south of the county, and it's astonishing what is happening in terms of the speed and the value of the house sales. So that's definitely the debate we have to have in the next, when we're next politically reporting about the review and going forward. That's exactly the debate. I don't want to commit myself now because we don't have all the information. But yeah, we absolutely have to talk through those challenges and how we make sure whatever version of next plan we have delivers what we want. And also really what do we want? You know, are we being aspirational, challenging some of those social and economic challenges? Or do we retreat to a bit of a let's do as little as possible because it's easier officer-wise and member-wise. So yeah, some really difficult and challenging discussions to come, but I think they're ones that will be really exciting as well.
Okay, happy with that? Councillor Becker?
Yeah, I do have one last question. So don't want to monopolise time, Chair, but very briefly, the last AMR suggested that we have an LDP review. This AMR suggests we have an LDP review. Considering that it's placed on the previous financial year, what's taking so long? What's the hold up? Why are we not doing it?
Yeah, fair question, Chair. This third AMR is a starting point of that review report. So again, it's something we haven't done before, but we've had to work through the mechanisms. There's also been an incredible amount of discussion in the last 12 months about what we're doing regionally. At an officer level, planning officer level, we certainly support having a strategic development plan, and we've been debating for several years, but now in the last year in particular, how we get there, what's the best way of getting to it. That hasn't got political or sort of chief exec leader approval yet, because that's had to wait for the Cardiff Capital Region Joint Committee to be established. So we're heading towards that process, and we're hoping for a decision on that one or the other. But yeah, we spent a lot of time working out how we align this work with the aspiration for a strategic plan. Without going off on too much of a tangent, Chair, the 10 authorities in the South East Wales region, 7 of us have plans that expire in 2021, 3 plans expire in 2026. So organisationally, in that sense, we've never really been better aligned to get on with it. We all have an LDP now, as of this January. All 10 of us have an LDP. But there's some challenges around resources and how we best get there. So there's been some delays around that. This is part of the work starting anyway, but we've also been a person and a bit down in the team for the best part of 12 months, which we're slowly resolving. So it's putting all those bits together and cracking on. But we have got to crack on with some pace now, because we have this expiry date looming as well.
Thank you very much. Councillor Alan Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Mark. Mark, there's an awful lot of amber in this report, and there's an awful lot of red as well, which clearly indicates that the current plan isn't working. And at the end of each of these pages, there is a statement that no action is currently required, continue to monitor. What I don't see is any action plan to address any of the issues that are highlighted in the plan. So are we saying as an authority that all of these things that could push this LDP forward are out of our control? All of their actions that we can take as an authority to push this LDP forward? To take Kelly's point, if we are going to promote ourselves as a business centre, then that means, forget the Severn Bridge, the demand for housing will increase, because if we have more people employed, they will want somewhere to live. as a committee member, and I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure the other committee members feel the same, what I would like to see is some progress on what actions we are going to take this LDP forward. Because at the moment, I see us at the end of this term of this council in 4 years' time being in exactly the same position, if not a worse position than we are now. So I know that, you know, it's not all your fault, right? That there are other issues at work here and it's very complicated, but we seem to be doing an awful lot of debating and talking, and what we really need is a series of actions which we put in place to address the issues. Because otherwise, I really don't, I mean, we, as a member of the planning committee, as you know, we are looking at and approving developments outside of the LDP purely because we are not making progress on the LDP. And my concern is that eventually you'll be coming to the planning committee and saying, well, we've got to do this because we're not making progress there, and we really need to make progress on that LDP. So, you know, I'm a manufacturing man. I believe in action rather than debating. And I think, you know, that debate needs to end now, and we need to have an action plan to address this issue. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Chair, I completely agree. I appreciate what's being said about the amber indicators, and it's saying that there's no action needed at present on those. I mean, that's looking at the current plan, but ultimately the conclusion of the report is the action we need is to do this review report and start revising the LDP in one form or another. So that is the action. So yeah, aside from the reply to Councillor Becker's question about why the delay from last year to now, then yeah, we've got to crack on with this. This is what we've got to do, and those actions will come from this review and the revision of the plan. We are going to continue in the short to medium term to have that challenge with the 5-year supply and unallocated sites while we're doing the new plan. We're going to have those two things in tandem, but we'll just have to deal with that. So, but I would partly say, not quite in our defence, but taking that pragmatic approach to those unallocated sites is evidence of us taking action. We could just say, well, it's a plan-led system. The way it's calculated is a bit broken, and we'll review the plan and it will come out in the wash in a few years' time. I don't think that's the way to go, as we discussed a little bit in last committee. We have got to get on with it. So we're taking a pragmatic approach where it's appropriate on those sites in the short term, but the really big challenge and the big action is doing this LDP revision. So that's what we're saying. We're proposing we crack on with.
Before you come back with your supplementary, Alan, Kelly wants to add to that. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I completely agree with your perspectives, and I think it's a matter of frustration to us all that the planning system necessarily, because of national legislation, moves really, really slowly. It's bureaucratic, it's out of date, it's archaic in places. And over the last year to 18 months, the goalposts seem to be moving all of the time. So, for example, TAN 1, which is around housing land supply, if you don't have a 5-year housing land supply, so what are they going to do? You know, we've been talking about revising that guidance to make it purposeful, to make it helpful. But again, you know, that guidance is still in place. It has no teeth. It doesn't really help us. It's out of date. It's not fit for purpose. At the same time, you've had lots of positioning, frankly, at the regional level. So it's not just a case of us being able to say, let's crack on with our own LDP and let's just deal with Monmouthshire's destiny. Because if the rest of the region says, we want all the strategic sites and we want to grow, and actually, when you look at population projections, Monmouthshire is not with you. You know, we're almost we're almost creating sort of a competition. So we've had to play it really, really carefully. We won't engage in some of the games that others are doing. I think what we've got to try and do is balance some of the opportunities we've got going for us in a regional context with the ability to get on, get ahead, adjust and modify our plan, if not as completely as we'd like, as quickly as we'd like, as a first step, just to get a foothold, so we can just put a flag down and say, this isn't sleepy old Monmouthshire, this isn't the land of milk and honey where you think everything's great and we're all wealthy and affluent, because it isn't like that. So we are trying to inch it along, but I think the difficulty is at the moment is this looming spectre of a regional strategic development plan that is sitting very much with the leaders now of the Cardiff capital region, because they've decided to speed things up and to be more pragmatic. They'll take that under the umbrella of the Cardiff capital region city deal. So unfortunately, I know it's called a local development plan, but we don't always have the freedom and flexibility at the local level to be able to move as quickly as we can. But we're trying to influence that. So Mark is the chair, thankfully, of the South East Wales Strategic Planning Group, so has high levels of influence. So we're just trying to sort of get some pace and to accelerate. You know, you have to be practical about this. You know, what are we waiting for? Are we going to wait for markets to come and go and, you know, opportunities to sort of pass us by? We're cheek by jowl with the second most economically competitive city in the UK, Bristol. You know, it's one thing to look that way, but we've got to look, you know, our planning system needs to look the other way as well. So lots of challenges, but, you know, I'm fully confident in Mark and the team that we are making an impact. And, you know, by following process and adhering to what some of the others want and what the regional will is, shouldn't compromise our ability to be able to make the progress we need to at the local level. Is just trying to keep a foot in both camps at the moment to make sure we get our fair allocation, but importantly, the resources that we're going to need to be able to deliver. Because otherwise, I'm afraid we'd be overlooked. They've already consigned us to market time status in the city deal, which, you know, I wasn't having for a second.
Okay, did you want to say something else, Mark, on that?
Yeah, Chair, only really briefly, probably to clarify. Sorry, I've talked about this in different venues so many times, I probably assumed I'd said it, but I hadn't. In terms of short form revision, if we did propose going down that route, the only reason we're even thinking about that would be as a bit of a pragmatic solution to keep us having plan coverage until we have a regional plan and that framework catches up. It's not because we think the strategy that we have is fit for the long-term future or we have the best plan ever. It would just be to make sure we don't have a vacuum or cause problems. But yeah, whether or not that's our preferred option is weighing in.
Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm very much aware that these things are very complicated. My background is commercial, so I'm used to things happening quite quickly, and I'm becoming aware, unfortunately, that in local government things are rather more complicated than that and much more difficult to do. So as my boss used to say to me, it's an observation, not a criticism. I think what we are saying as a committee is if there are things that we can do to help things along, then we certainly need to do them. Those things are out of our control. Well, we can't do anything about those, but we need to do everything that we can possibly do to try and move this plan forward, because if the county is going to move forward, this plan certainly needs to move forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, Councillor Strong.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just I was going to speak about the shortfall, really. Over the last 3 years, 687 houses have been completed, and there's a shortfall of 797. That seems to have been a fairly constant average over the three-year period. On the key findings, there are three sites: Crick, One Stowe Road, where 140 can't be done at the moment, and Vinegar Hill, where no progress has been made. So of the 2,000 or so houses that are on that in the key findings list, 650 there's no progress at all on those, and possibly they may have to be taken out. I don't know. If they were taken out, have you got alternative sites in mind that can be brought into the LDP? Or is it, are we going to have year-on-year deficit in the provision of houses? It is a worrying thing. And if that was the case, would the Welsh Government or a department of the Welsh Government then say to Monmouthshire County Council, we'll take this on and you'll build houses in X, Y or Z towns? Could you perhaps comment on that?
Yeah, Chair. In terms of the 650, thankfully there is progress on the Crick Road site, but the other 360 odd, 365, are a real challenge. We in the next plan, whichever form it takes, if we think there's sites that aren't coming forwards, then we would take them out of the plan. We don't at this stage have other ones up our sleeves that has to go through the whole process. So potentially looking at what the new plan strategy is, where development should be allocated. People, communities, developers can put forward proposed sites, and we'd encourage them to do that as well. It's quite often developers or landowners put forward lands and communities object. But if we can get some input from communities into where they think that growth should happen, because there will be growth of some level, then that will help us. So that will come at a future stage. In the short term, or if we decided to say that we weren't going to revise our plan, we were going to wait for a bit, then the Welsh Government can step in. They can direct that we need to revise our plan. They could take our planning powers office if they think we're failing or not progressing that, or they can direct us to do a joint plan with one or more neighbouring authority. Again, none of which fills us with any joy, not from my own career prospects solely, but we want to be shaping our own destiny, not having other people telling us what to do or taking our powers off us and doing it to us. That's not where we want to be in the slightest, or where I want you to be. We still have that challenge with unallocated sites coming forward. So if we were just to bury our heads in the sand and say, well, we haven't got a 5-year supply, but we're going to wait and it'll all come out on the wash, then we'll have what we always refer to as planning by appeal, which is exactly where Caerphilly is at the moment. They've got sites coming in left, right and centre. They're tending to refuse them, and they're pretty much all being allowed at appeal at the moment. So the council is really, and the communities have lost any say over what's happening there in a positive fashion, which again isn't where we want to be. So we need to grab this bull by the horns and take control of where we're going as an authority. There's a bit of a, without again going off into much technical stuff, there's a way in which we can look at our 5-year land supply in the next plan. It's a pretty uninspiring answer, to be honest with you, but the advice from the Welsh Government seems to be you can plan in sense of the 5-year supply just based on your actual need. So if we look very solely at our need, our indigenous population is declining. We've got an ageing population and younger people are leaving. So fewer natural births, etc. If you look in a very narrow way at our need, we could argue for a really quite low level of growth and potentially be measured against that. And then we could add in our aspirational growth in terms of doing things socially, economically, for our communities in a different fashion. So there could be a solution of doing that. So we could still plan for what we want, but be measured against a minimal figure. I think if I'm being frank with you, the challenge there for us will be, some of you who were previously members remember the longest meeting, or the longest day as it's always affectionately called. It will very much be a challenge if you're pressured as members or in a technical sense as officers to effectively go for as little as we can. We could start off with a plan that says this is the need, this is the aspiration, and by the end of that council meeting we could end up right down there, which again isn't where I think we should be aiming or where we should be. But I realise there's some real challenges around all of that. It's easier for me to say sat here than for some of you to deal with. But we've got to grab those arguments. We've got to really think, as Kelly said, about where we're going. What is our future? Are we destined to become that leafy retirement home? I say that slightly tongue-in-cheek. Or do we want to try and address those challenges with our demography? Try and retain our young people. The reason they're leaving, is that because of house prices and jobs? So is that something that we can and should address or seek to address?
Councillor Strong, did you want to come back on that? Are you okay? Okay. Councillor Devi?
Thank you, Chairman. There's all sorts of things come out of this, don't they? I mean, the one thing, if you're talking about housing and people seeking housing, they don't think about county boundaries or anything like that. They just think about where they want to go. And one of the issues for us is with people coming across here from the Bristol area, they just look upon it as the other side of the river. Particularly as across the other side of the river, there's Gloucestershire. All right, we're butted onto it, but for them, they'll just come here because they look at it as a geographical area rather than two nations or two counties. They don't have the problems that we have, but we have to accommodate what they want. Do we speak at all to, say, Gloucestershire, so that we have some idea of what they are planning and what they see as the amount of migration that is likely to come from the area of South Gloucestershire and Bristol across here. They must have an idea about that. It must be exercising them in many ways, because they've got to deal with it in Gloucestershire. So in many ways we share that problem. So are we trying to share the problem and maybe come up to a solution that will help us all? The other thing is when we talk about the developments that we are doing here, when we talk about the aging population and what the housing we want to provide, etc. In the recent discussions that we've had with the Narren Bevan Health Authority, for instance, they have no idea of what we are planning for housing. They don't take that into account at all. And that is what we were told by the head honcho from there. When we spoke to him about were they aware of housing development, for instance, in the Chepstow area, where we want to get the hospital working properly there again. They are saying that they, and it's probably, I don't know whether we are proactive about it, but as far as he is concerned, they are not chasing that information at all. They are just trying to work, about the fourth, fifth go now, their group of hospitals as efficiently as they can. So there are issues with dealing with this, and then the one big thing that really does worry me is we talk about the A466 in Chepstow, south of Penterry and St Lawrence coming towards the roundabout. I know that has been we've turned it down for the reasons, the green belt and the development area. What are the pressures likely to be? Because somebody's going to ask us again about that, aren't they? Because we have to find some, theoretically, I guess the Assembly is going to say, you have got to find more development land in and around Chepstow. What's going to be the response to that? Because I don't know where there is development land in and around Chepstow that will meet the needs of what we were talking, which Matt was talking about earlier. The developers now, what is their minimum scale of housing that they are prepared to step up and develop? And I always try and think out of the box and be radical. We're talking about all these developments around the place, which are sort of picking it off in small amounts. How about an entirely new settlement in Monmouthshire? And why shouldn't it be in the southeast? There's plenty of land in the southeast. Why don't we talk about an entirely new settlement in Monmouthshire? I know some people were talking about a new settlement in Monmouthshire. I've been muttering about it for ages, and I know where it could be as well. But are we beginning to think in terms of being really radical? And if these developers don't want to do it, develop sites with us, why don't we look at the housing associations and see if they would do developments with us? I know there's some work being done on that at the moment, but why don't we look at them and say, well, if you, to the developers, if you don't want to do it, we have the ability to do it ourselves. I don't see how we are going to accommodate what's coming towards us, as Kelly has already said, with the tools that are being given to us from central government to be able to handle this situation. So we've got to do something different. Is that a worthwhile contribution, Chair? I don't know. But that's how I feel about it, David.
Thank you for those rounds of questions. Councillor Devi, Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. There's about 5 questions in there, but I think my answer to them all, you pretty much said it in your last line, actually, is that we can't, if we're going to tackle all of those things, we can't keep doing it the way we have been doing it. And I think that answers the same for all of them. So one of the first points you made was about the cross-boundary discussions with England. Yeah, we do have some of those discussions. At the moment, it's at a bit of a lull because neither of us is preparing a plan. But when that starts up again, those conversations will ramp up. But I think there's always more that we can do in that sense of working better. It is happening. By way of an example, we had a meeting recently with colleagues in the Forest of Dean and Gloucestershire because we now know that the Sudbury Army Barracks is being disposed of. Highly likely to come forward for housing, and in the region of 900 housing units. So we're then thinking through all the implications that has. Great in terms of some of that housing demand on that side of this semi-pretend line being mopped up. But equally it has impacts on education. So at the moment we have people from Chepstow who tend to go to Wydene. That school may not have capacity in the future if those local residents are going there. So does that affect us with Chepstow Comprehensive? The amenities in Chepstow, because for that area, Chepstow is the main town. Again, it's a completely pretend line. No one thinks I can't go there to get my groceries or go to the doctors. You just go where is nearest. So we need to think through all of that. And that opens up all kinds of questions. I don't know if I even mentioned the Chepstow bypass. But there's some really serious conversations and thinking that we need to have around all of that. And how it works. We can't just pretend in a way which we know some organisations do that vehicles get to the edge of the boundary and are no longer an issue. We had that discussion around the Maybe Bridge sites and engagement from other parties or the Welsh Government. It's a trunk road our side of the boundary, isn't the other side, is in England. The cars magically vanish or magically appear. So we can't carry on working like that. So we definitely need to address that. The same issue arises around discussions with the health board. So in any LDP, we have to engage with them. My experience wasn't here at the time, but it has been. They'll come back and say they don't foresee problems. They don't need more infrastructure. That was the answer we had here. It's certainly not what we're hearing from your communities, from our communities. So we need to do more in terms of that engagement. I think we had a discussion in a previous, I think it may have been a select meeting actually, where we talked about, we have all this information about our 5-year land supply, which says exactly where we think houses are going to be built every year for the next 5 years. We're very happy to share that with the health board. It is out there publicly, but I don't hide behind that answer. That's like, we don't assume people look at our website every day to see what they might find. We need to proactively direct them to it and point them at it. We have the same conversation around broadband providers and telecom providers so they can plan their infrastructure knowing what's coming. So I believe that has been shared fairly recently with them. But again, we need that whole conversation around the next plan, whichever way it takes that future housing development to be much stronger with the health board. Because it doesn't feel terribly joined up at the moment. The other questions you asked around the scale of housing or who's building and doing something radical, yeah, I think we absolutely need to consider doing something radical, and a new settlement could be part of that. has its own challenges in terms of being a fairly slow burn for the site to come forwards, but it's absolutely an option that I think we should be looking at, rather than saying that our 4 main areas, the 3 main towns and Sevenside, can keep having those housing estates added to the edge, and we can't carry on doing that forever. So the scale of housing as well that you talked about is a very different argument, but one discussion we're having. I think probably everyone in South East Wales has fallen into a similar trap or scenario where we've tried to meet the bulk of our housing need with bigger strategic housing sites. But as soon as you're over 75 to 100 dwellings, you've pretty much limited your market to 5 PLCs. They have their own challenges around their capacity, what they can build physically, and what they want to, because they don't want to particularly compete with each other or with themselves. So we need to think again, are there ways we can potentially allocate some smaller sites? If they're around about 50 dwellings, does that bring a whole new set of players into the market? Where are those players? So we will talk fondly of these small local builders. We need to really engage with them and find out how many of those are still trading, because an awful lot of them did go under in the downturn. Will they come back? Can we help them? And also, we are right on the border, as we keep saying. There's a lot more housing operators building in England. So what is stopping them coming over that border? And we're trying to engage in that way as well to see if there are people we can entice. One of the companies interested in the Rockfield Road site is somebody that doesn't currently operate in Wales and might cross the boundary. So some of those things are starting to happen. That would be great. So yeah, I guess those are the key things. Yeah, the summary of that is, if we do carry on doing what we've always done, we're not going to solve the problems, is my advice. So we have got to look at doing these things differently, and that applies to every one of the questions you've asked.
You satisfied with that, Councillor Devey? Do you want a quick response?
Yes, I'm pleased about that response. I really am. I think we should be a county that leads the way rather than a county that makes do with the crumbs off the master's table, if you like. I think we should be the pacemakers. And it's always the same, isn't it? The people who are more lean and hungry, they are the ones that are more dynamic, and I think that should go for us. I did mention, too, the housing associations as possible developers. You went through that rather quickly, and I'm a slow old fellow here. Did you touch on the housing associations as being an option for development?
No, I didn't, Chair, but they certainly are. We have 3 RSLs operating in Monmouthshire, Mellin, MHA and the Pobble Group. And we have really positive working relationships with them. They're reviewing and changing the way they're operating as well, because they're now able to build in a different fashion. So they're building, as you know from Coed Glass, they're building a mix of market and affordable housing, and coming forward in a different model. Pobble's done that. Some of you have been to the Loftus Garden Village site in Newport, which is an example of how they've done something different. So yeah, we're certainly working with them. They're very keen to do more in Monmouthshire. I've been meeting with each of them with both my planning and my housing hat on. And the answer from them all has actually been they would like to do more, but the land simply isn't there for them at the moment. So yeah, that's definitely an opportunity for us. Insofar as we can, obviously, from a very land use planning point of view, we're allocating land. We can't govern who buys it or who builds, but they're out there as players in the market. We can look at the size of the housing sites, as I mentioned, and that can potentially change who's in the equation. Or, of course, if we're the landowner, then we have far more options available to us. Crick Road being an example. If that were privately owned, it probably would have gone to a PLC. But as a council, we're working with Mellin, looking to bring that forward. So we have some different control. Obviously, we're going to try and square off in my own head having a whole council outlook and perspective with, I can't allocate land in the plan just because we own it. It has to be the best best land in a planning sense, but some of that can certainly help around deliverability and the type of thing we're delivering. So we need to look, really closely at that and how we go forward.
Okay. Very, very quickly. Very quickly. If you put your microphone on.
The settlement idea, the one thing that goes through my mind is the settlement is one segment of the virtuous circle, if you like. If we develop a settlement, then there is the opportunity to attract people to come here to work. So you've got the houses, you've got the marketplace, and of course if you're talking about the settlement that being in the southeast of the county, we've got this latest education facility and whatnot. So, and we've got the biggest catchment of newly developed secondary schools probably anywhere in Wales, maybe perhaps in the whole of the UK. So we do have the makings of something being born out of necessity, if you like, the makings of something that could be really, really good for our young people and our existence, even the older people, because we have to earn money to be able to take care of them as well. But we do have the makings with that, if it did come about, to be a really significant developer. Monmouthshire about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ahead, but it's got to start somewhere, and I think about now is the time we start to have a look at it. I'm with Alan, like to do something. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Debbie. Councillor Feekins.
Thank you, Chair. For Mark. I think we're very lucky to live in a county where we embrace change and where we are constantly reviewing the parameters of our thoughts. Change is happening around us, and the pace of change is increasing as we're going through. And so whilst we're trying to, or we've come from a legislative background of developing a 10-year plan, if we go back 10 years ago, Uber wasn't invented, wasn't thought of, Airbnb wasn't. Both of these are companies which have changed the world completely forever. Are we able to adopt a strategy which continues like a short form revision sort of strategy, which will continue to review the LDP in time, and then at the anniversary of the LDP, adopt the modular inputs of those short-term revisions as policy? So rather than having to redevelop the whole of the LDP at 10-year term, we can simply get to that point in time having, some of those short-term revisions maybe 2 or 3 years old. So a bit like coursework, if you like, with the GCSE. So we're constantly doing coursework rather than having a big exam at the end. That would probably relieve the pressure within the offices, and we wouldn't necessarily have these bigger, longer stays of the year. But it would also mean we're more lighter on our feet, thinking on our feet, moving forward, and we can react to that change. So my question is, are we able to adopt a strategy like that, or are we completely handcuffed by Welsh legislation?
I wouldn't say that we're completely handcuffed. I think the extent of what we can do with a short form revision is limited. So if we were looking at a short form revision now, and we wanted to do something with the housing and something with employment policies, I think we're instantly out of the realms of a short form revision. We're into a new plan, because it's 2 massive chunks of policy framework. It's a challenge anyway. We were having this conversation in a planning team meeting yesterday on a more of a regional basis, because that'll be an even longer term. But if you think about planning forward on a regional basis, 20-25 years, if you go back 20-25 years, exactly as you were thinking, in Newport, we were still plinning around steelworks being there. Things have changed so quickly, and sometimes in a really unpredictable fashion. So it is we've got to try and create, this is why we always look a bit confused. We're trying to create a framework that delivers what we need and what we want as a county. It's got to be evidence-based but aspirational, from my point of view. But we're delivering what we think we need and is in the right place and doing the right thing, but also being flexible enough that when things change, it's still delivering. So some of that is a real challenge. As part of the plan process, whatever we do, there's always a 4-year review period. So after 4 years from adoption, we'd have to review the plan anyway. So we'd always have that opportunity to review things and to see what's working, what isn't, and change it. But yeah, we don't really want to get into a cycle of doing a completely new plan every 3 to 4 years, because it's pretty resource intensive on everybody. Doesn't really help our communities or investors in terms of certainty going forwards. So I don't think, in answer to your question, I don't think we can address that via a short form revision now. But yeah, we do need to try and do it in a plan that delivers our aspirations as we know them, but is also flexible enough going forward. But yeah, with so many unknowns, it is really tricky. And also with some of the economic and employment changes, so much of what we think about in a plan is physically land-based. But our SMEs, which are a massive part of our economy, are very much really small businesses in people's homes, dotted around the county. And probably the thing that would benefit them the most would be decent broadband and phone reception, which isn't something you'd physically draw a line on in a plan, or in some ways can deliver through a planning system. But some of that we need to factor in as well. The way in which all of these things work in the future, again, we don't know. By the time we get to the plan's adoption, we will be sat in a council chamber, physically in a room. Who knows? Even that stuff's changing fast.
You want to come back on that, Councillor Figgins?
No, just one furtherance to that question, though, I guess. Obviously, our LDP is based on, or comes under the umbrella of Planning Policy Wales as a sort of lead-in policy. That gets reviewed. Do we have like an auto-renew within the LDP? Do we have like a sort of auto-renew mechanism? So the minute PPW is renewed or reviewed and a new issue comes out, does our LDP automatically fall in line with that new Planning Policy Wales, or are we stuck still to, in effect, what could be a 9 or 10 year old policy with LDP?
There's kind of triggers in there, not so much maybe with Planning Policy Wales, and the changes in that are generally fairly innocuous anyway, so probably wouldn't change the path of our LDP. But if something radical did happen in the plan, I don't know, for example, Planning Policy Wales, just for a ludicrous example, just said there shall be no greenfield developments, then yeah, we'd have to instantly revise our plan to follow in with that policy. What does have that trigger? The Welsh Government is currently preparing what they call a National Development Framework, which would have development plan status, would replace and hopefully be a lot better than the Wales Spatial Plan, which has many fine words but not a vast amount of substance, in my personal opinion. So once that's adopted, which is likely to be around 2022, we'd have to review our plan, make sure it still aligns. I don't imagine that will pose too many problems because it's going to be so high level and strategic. It probably wouldn't say anything too fundamental for our local plan. The bigger challenge will be with a strategic development plan. If we go down that route and when that's adopted, again, we'd have to ensure that our LDP aligns. So yeah, those again, safety valves / opportunities are still there. The challenge is making sure we're not just on this continuous conveyor belt of flux, both for resources and sanity. But yeah, those mechanisms are there.
Any further questions, Councillor Ronan? You want to come in on this?
Thank you, Chair. And thanks, Mark, for the helpful summary of the report. In the purposes of the AMR, you state that it allows the Council to assess impact the LDP is having on the social, economic and environmental well-being of the county. I'm curious to know what methods are used to assess the increased service needs when houses are built. For example, do you measure increased need for schooling places, GPs, time to travel to work, that sort of thing? Thank you.
I think we'll do a double act on this answer, if that's okay. In terms of yeah, in terms of education, is probably the easiest one of those to answer. That's not so much monitored through this AMR process as with each application on a bigger housing scheme, so anything more than 10 dwellings. We'll consult with the education team and they come back to us. This has come up at lots of meetings, Chair, so it's probably one that we need to address in some kind of member seminar. But they have a really pretty scientific set of Excel spreadsheets. They know live births, so they have all of those in the pipeline, so they know that somebody born today will pop out in our school in 5 years' time, or even 4 years' time with the preschool. They also have records of all the sites in the LDP and how fast they're coming forward, and all the sites with planning permission. So they have these tables predicting forwards. So they currently know who's in year 1 in Usk Primary. So next year they know who will be in year 2, etc. And then they factor in these new developments and live births as well going forward. And then from that we know how many children the school can accommodate, and they know what capacity is there. So there's a pretty good mechanism in that sense. That factors in whether or not we need Section 106 planning contributions to extend the schools. Again, what we end up doing there is what everybody does. It's the only way of doing it, but it isn't an exact science. So if there are more children, we have a way in which we calculate from experience how many children a development generates. It tends to be about 23 primary school children per 100 houses. That's Monmouthshire evidence. There's different figures based on 2-bed, 3-bed, 4-bed homes, but that's the average. So they factor that in. The challenge is we might find out that a development generates more children than the schools have capacity for. So we'll ask for a contribution. The downside is what we're asking for the contribution for. If, for example, a development generates 30 children, we'd seek a contribution for a new classroom. What it doesn't do is factor in the fact that those children will be different ages. So it works perfectly if all of those children are in year 3 and we build a classroom for children in year 3, for example. But yeah, that isn't how life works. But there is no practical way around that. We couldn't make them fund an entire school refurb for a new classroom at each stage, just in case. So that's what we do, and that's the best that we can do. But we do things like, for example, the 21st century schools. There was a lot of discussion around the Monmouth Comp to make sure the size of that, because we're conscious all of those policies and funding from Welsh Government means we're penalised if we have surplus places. So that school was designed to be the right size. It was actually smaller than the old one, but we had a lot of discussions to ensure that factored in all of the new proposed development in Monmouth. Because what we don't want to be doing, as far as we can physically or humanly prevent, is extending a school, before the paint's even dry. That's just ridiculous. But so we're covering off that side of things. Doctor surgeries, that kind of thing, I think is an area of weakness, if I'm honest. We've agreed recently in planning committee we're going to consult the health boards on all planning applications for more than 10 new homes. The extent to which we get a reply that we can use, I'm not sure. I've been involved in schemes in the past, and I believe there's schemes here, where we've had bigger sites. We've had sites, a bit of that site set aside for something like a GP surgery. But again, my slightly patchy understanding, there's some challenges the way just that whole system works. So in effect, a lot of the GPs are like private businesses, and if a GP wants to set up a new practice and thinks there's a market for it and there's NHS funding, then they'll do it. So we can make that land available, but actually delivering something is a bit of a next step. And presumably the NHS is looking at their budgets and looking at rationalising or economies of scale, which is a challenge for us with our rural and dispersed communities. So I think that's an area of weakness that we definitely need to work on. The third part of your question has just completely escaped my mind.
I was curious if you were looking at any travel to work time changes, because there's more traffic on the roads and there's more delays as a result, potentially.
We do. I'll pass to Rachel, if I may, for a bit more detail, because there's a bit of a survey that takes place trying to look at travel to work. However, it's based on quite a small sample size, so I wouldn't pin your aspirations for the next plan on it. It's just a bit of an indication. I guess the other thing I'd throw into the mix, though, is we plan for sites, for example, Wannerstow Road, we've got some mixed sites, so we've got employment and housing. The example I always come back to is I live on such a site outside of the county, but I don't work on any of the businesses that are there. I know I used to work in Newport, which wasn't on site, and now I work here, which isn't on site. My partner doesn't work on site either. And possibly part of me thinks I wouldn't want to, because for my own well-being, I quite like a bit of separation distance. You know, that house 2 doors up was on the market. I wouldn't want to look out my window every day and see work necessarily. I might go mad. So we can deliver some of that stuff in land use planning terms, but where people choose to live and then either choose to work or have to work is a bit beyond our control. But it is something we're mindful of. Do you want to talk about the survey?
Travel to work data is derived from the census, so we're not going to get anything else on that until the next census. So that's really quite dated and it's not really very helpful. Commuting stats are derived from Welsh Government statistics. But again, like Mark said, it's such a small sample, it's really difficult to get anything significant or meaningful out of them. So it's a really difficult area to really get any useful figures on, if you like. And I think they're stopping actually producing those figures in the future. So again, it's difficult to get a real feel of what the travel to work is and commuting stats.
Councillor Rowland, did you want to come back, or are you satisfied with it?
I'm satisfied with the responses, thank you. But may I ask an entirely different question as well, Chair?
Yeah, of course you may.
Thank you. I view Monmouthshire as being one of the high-performing counties in the UK. We benchmark ourselves typically against Welsh authorities and also against English authorities. Are there other benchmarks we should be using? Perhaps typically English authorities which have a similar demographic to ourselves, similar work profile, if there is such a place. I was thinking about Worcestershire, just to give us an idea of how we compare with like authorities. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, yeah.
In terms of a wider planning service, there's a lot of benchmarking that goes on. I'll come back to that in a second. But just on the local development plan side of things, there isn't really. I mean, each of our sort of social, geographic, economic needs are quite different. We know that we need a plan and we need to deliver certain things. So we don't kind of benchmark in that way on an LDP. We do look at what other people are doing. We're largely constrained in a way for comparing apples with apples, constrained with Wales because things are quite different in England. But we're looking at things like the 5-year supply, and we have all kinds of discussions. So if someone's doing well, we try and look at why. So as an example, on 5-year housing land supply, we know that Newport's doing really well. They're having the highest build rates per year in the whole of Wales, the highest for them ever. And there's a few things around that, which I possibly know a bit more about with my background. But they have pretty successfully put some deliverable sites in their LDP. They've gone for growth and it's happening. That's probably bolstered by a couple of factors. One is around possibly a bit more flexibility than here in terms of viability negotiations. A lot of those sites have got fairly low numbers in terms of affordable housing, but equally they're quite problematic brownfield sites, so that always crops up as a challenge. A lot of those sites have been in the pipeline for quite a long time. So when we were there, I was there doing the LDP. A lot of those sites were carried forward from the previous UDP. A lot of them had permission. So we didn't have a longest day meeting in Newport. That was all pretty non-controversial. Most of the sites had consent, were coming through, really quite a slow burn. but they're now really delivering. So that has helped them, and potentially in a few years' time we'll find the same, because apart from the 2 sites we touched on earlier, one of which is more of a worry for me, the Vinegar Hill site, but the others, they are coming forwards. The Wannistow Road one will happen. I'm confident of that. It's more when. So hopefully with these things factoring in, the houses have consent, will get built, and the economic external things like the tolls will bolster that. So that will help with time. I mean, there's other aspects as well. Again, we were talking about in the team meeting yesterday. Just in a general planning service, we've got different angles of things we're measured against. So we can chase quality and outcome. We can chase housing numbers, or we can chase speed on planning applications, or we can try to do a combination of all 3. I think some authorities weigh up those things differently. There's discussions here we have around outcomes, placemaking, that are really high standards and aspirational. And I think when all is said and done, we could chuck out some numbers, we could get numbers of houses, but in 5 years' time, will anyone thank us for some of it if we just focus on that? I'd suggest not. So I think we've got the balance far better here in terms of outcome than some places. We could definitely do with picking up on the speed with applications in some cases, but again, a vast amount of that has been beyond our control. We're having lengthy viability discussions or issues with Western Power on Dairy Farm, just getting to the bottom of how that's going to work, and then viability discussions. There's more that we can do on our side, but if the council decided what's important today is determine all your applications in 8 weeks, and we'll talk about this at a future meeting when we do the performance report. But the short answer is I can give you 100% in 8 weeks, but an awful lot of them will be no's, and the ones that aren't no's will be granting a bit of mediocrity, because it's not bad enough to refuse and win, but we could have got better. If that's what we want, I can do it. It's not what I want. I don't think it's what you want. Again, if we just want housing numbers, we could churn out some pretty quick stuff. Pile them high, sell them cheap, he says flippantly. But again, that's not what we're aspiring to. It's trying to really get that balance of all those bits and pieces. But our eye's got to be on the placemaking and the quality, because this stuff's got to be there, beyond our lifetimes, and it's got to keep on working. So there isn't a lot of benchmarking on that front. There's a lot of benchmarking that goes on the planning service on a wider note, and again I'll touch on this in a future meeting, Chair, when we do the performance report. But there's a big project ongoing at the moment to strip back all of our data in terms of sort of efficiency, speed of decisions, cost of service, and get a proper apples with apples comparison across Wales. And the people that are doing this have already done it in England, so then we can start benchmarking sideways as well. And again, we can learn from that. So some of that will be, well, maybe we're not the quickest in Wales, but is that a conscious decision, or are there bits of that we can improve on? And so on and so forth. But yeah, just solely on the LDP, there's not really a vast amount of that benchmarking. We do share ideas on a regional basis in particular, and even an all Wales basis. So we talked earlier about different ways of delivering housing. We recently, I was at a chief planners meeting. We had a presentation from Flintshire. Their council's done a joint venture, are building houses in partnership with others. They're on the ground, they're selling, and they've found that as a solution for part of their needs. Cardiff's doing something quite similar at the moment. So we're all sharing those ideas and seeing if there's different ways of doing things. Where authorities do have a 5-year land supply, we're delving into why and how, and are there things we could do differently to achieve that. And equally, there's some authorities who have got an extremely low supply, but are looking at doing some different things. Quite often their economic situations are different to ours, so they're looking at enticing developers in rather than fending them off from inappropriate locations, and enticing them to the good locations like we are. But yeah, we are having those more general conversations.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I invite Kelly to make a final contribution, Does anyone else want to make any more questions? Any councillors? Yeah, Councillor Becker.
Sorry, I should probably sit in the middle because the hardest part for me is keeping silent after speaking first. A couple of things have come up. We talked about the economic sort of constraints or that feed into the planning system or should do in the LDP, but there's also a sort of a traffic route of traffic the other way. You say that planning couldn't solve the broadband problem, for instance, but we could be specifying in the LDP that house builders have to use fibre to the premises, you know, or could we not? We can't.
No, I'd suggest that we can't, Chair. We can encourage that kind of thing, but in terms of actually having it as a requirement, we couldn't, because in planning terms, a development is acceptable without it. You know, in a really, I know that sounds like we're aiming for the minimum, but that is essentially where we get to. We've been having this conversation though separately. It's been raised by a couple of members, Councillor Jones included, or in particular. So we've been looking at ways of certainly enticing people to do it. But is there a way, for example, through our highways adoption agreements, we can require them just to put the ducting in, so that then someone in the future has just got to feed a cable through. So those conversations are continuing. We could do more with things like broadbands if we have SIL, Community Infrastructure Levy, in the future. But in terms of Section 106, there's some legal challenges around that as well, because we'd have to say that contribution was necessary to make the development in question acceptable. And our very basic challenge is most of our broadband trouble spots are the rural areas, which by definition are not where we're building the houses. So we can't kind of get improved amenities into those areas in that way. But it's a challenge we need to look at, definitely. We can make sure we have policies in place that support it, but whether we can go quite as far as requiring it is a different challenge. Although Councillor Murphy was speaking to me last week, there's a project he's involved with or talking to people with, which is a way of people getting Welsh Government assistance to get 4G in their homes for a pretty reasonable rate, it sounds like. So there might be some solutions out there. That in itself might mean when they need more mobile phone masts. Yeah, so there's ways in which we're involved and can facilitate, but as the actual driving force, I'm not quite sure we're the ones to do it. Before I wind up, Chair, if you don't mind, I was just going to thank members for their contributions. I've been really encouraged by the challenge and also the appetite that seems to be there for actually doing things differently and really going forward in a different fashion in the future, rather than doing the minimum that we have to. So we like that challenge. That's great.
Kelly, you want to conclude?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And yeah, just to echo Mark's remarks, really, it has been a fascinating discussion. In many ways, I've been sat here thinking, even though we had to bring the AMR today because it's a statutory document and that's time bound, the discussion is somewhat the wrong way around. The planning system is the enabler. It needs to do what we need it to do. And in a few weeks' time, we have a workshop session on the shape of our future county, what it needs to look like, what we can reasonably foresee is happening in the next 30, 25, 20 years, and how we can start building that knowledge, that foresight into some of our activity, policy and priorities today. So really we need to try and get the conversation the right way around, what is the future economy? I talked about knowledge growth being one of our principal drivers. When we start talking about house building, given our finances as a council, is that something we should be proactively engaging in the future, given we've got land, sites and opportunities? We need to start thinking about some of these big questions, the purpose our county will serve in the future. Is it good enough that we could be destined to be a dormitory place? Do we have to start thinking about what it takes to keep our young people, not just in terms of housing or affordable housing, because the housing could be brilliant, but if the high-skilled jobs are not here and our schools are not actually churning out the skill sets that we need to serve the economies of the future, then, I don't think we'll win the day. So at that workshop session, we've got to have a big conversation. And I want this conversation, Chair, to be ongoing. I think it's really important that scrutiny plays a role in holding officers to account. But there's a much wider role that you can play in scrutiny in terms of actually informing the debate, contributing your knowledge, your personal experiences, your local knowledge, what goes on in your community. But you all come from different backgrounds. You've all got something to offer. And I think if we're going to even start to understand the problems that we're trying to solve, we all have to be in this together. We have to drive this agenda forward. And not just because we don't want challenge when it comes to having a longest day and you saying, yeah, I agree with all this strategy in this site, but not in my area, because, it can't be about that anymore. It has to be about the bigger picture and the benefits at a county level. So I think if we start that conversation, that will be a particularly important point. I think what we need to devote some time to after that is thinking about how we can make that an ongoing live dynamic discussion. So yes, you have a work programme as a select committee, which is right and proper, but if we can anchor all of that in thinking about the future of our place, how it all contributes, the work that we need to do, the evidence that we need to build, the business cases that we need to construct. The important thing is the focus on the county. But from my role and perspective, I've got to make sure that this council develops a fundamentally new operating model. So in terms of the kind of place we want our county to be, our council needs to shape shift around that and to modernise and to be fit to deliver that vision for the county. So rather than just having an annual budget, we probably need to start thinking about a whole new organisational cost structure, which is very different to just having an annual budget. So we've got to get the conversation the right way around. One of the things I will be talking to you about when we have the session is the southeast corner of our county and strategic expansion opportunities, thinking about the hinterland, thinking about our relationship with the southwest of England, but importantly as well, our relationship with other parts of the world. So we've been involved in things like the compound semiconductor project recently. We've got companies in the supply chain on our doorstep that now could really expand, and they have global resonance and global opportunities. So I'd like to bring that specific opportunity to talk to you about, but the work session will be interactive. It will be very much focused on your contributions and how we can make sure that you have that input ongoing. Because I think if we just do it from an officer perspective and we present you with something to say yes or no, we will have fundamentally failed. And beyond you as members, we've got to think about how we get to the next level then and engage your constituents and your electorate in really thinking about the problems, the challenges that we need to solve and how we shape the future of our place.
Thanks, Kelly. And I think that's why, certainly as a committee, we wanted to have the future membership workshop so early on, because it is going to be an important driver, not just for our scrutiny session, but in terms of how the authority changes. But it's also going back to what Councillor Davis said, is about action. We've got to be about transforming our county. Councillor Rowan, do you want to say something quickly?
Thank you, Chair. Keely, the Future Monmouth Workshop is quite exciting, I think. And in order for members to prepare, it would be very beneficial if we could have good notice of the kind of questions that might be coming up so we can start to formulate ideas. Just a thought. Okay.
It'd be provocations rather than questions, if that's okay. If you're up for that.
Definitely.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rachel, for your contributions. So, next item on the agenda, item 6, is the Revenue and Capital Monitoring 2017-18 Outturn Statement. I think Mark is going to take us through this briefly. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You've got a glass of Marks this morning, I'm afraid. This is probably your first report that you've seen for this financial year, and certainly may be fresh to new members. It follows a very similar format that we've agreed with members in the past, but it may be worthwhile just pausing and explaining some of the context to you rather than presume that you automatically understand it. So This is the same report largely that goes to Cabinet, and one of the roles and responsibilities of Selects is to actually assess whether effective budget monitoring is taking place. So in effect, you're judging the activities of the senior leadership team and the senior management groups within directorates, but also the actions of Cabinet in terms of looking at whether the forecasts are valid, accurate, and whether they're reasonable or not. One of the problems that I have in providing such a comprehensive report is that members immediately want to get involved in doing the budget monitoring themselves. So I'd encourage you to decline that. But obviously, in providing a comprehensive report across the whole council, I appreciate this is also economy and development, so I do tend to make the job a little difficult for chairs, where members will look at particular things that are interested in them. I'm always happy to have a conversation with you outside of this group if it pertains to another area of the council, as Councillor Smith at the back there would attest to. You have my email address on the bottom of the list there, and if there's any explanations that you would like to understand, we can talk about those things separately. But predominantly in the way that we chunk up the budget, this session looks at those areas that are attributed to economy and development. Interestingly, the directorate structure for officers is slightly different than the select structure for members, so we have to make some pragmatic judgments about chunking up various directorates and where they appear for monitoring purposes to make sure that all those services are accurately covered. With things like children and young people and adult, that's a fairly simple prospect, but obviously you can appreciate that economy and development as strong communities can sometimes be flip sides of a very similar coin. So what we have done pragmatically in the past is presume that economy and development will look at largely the enterprise department, which is Kelly's domain, in terms of getting the right officers here to speak to some of the commentary. So the start of the report, as a general member, gives you an overview of the council per se. We look at the three aspects of the financial monitoring, which is the revenue position, the day-to-day running costs of the council, the capital projects that are agreed by council annually and how they're progressing, and actually also the level of reserves which help facilitate things like re-engineering and redesign of services and more ad hoc exceptional funding. So from a revenue context, the overall position is an overspend, a deficit position of 164,000. For new members, that's quite unusual at this time of the year. Normally it's a lot larger than that, and I suspect there is a degree of optimism bias to it. I've described some of that around the Treasury aspects later on. I always breathe a sigh of relief monitoring-wise once I've got through the summer period, because quite a lot of our services, and particularly around enterprise, are seasonal in nature, so you can imagine that a lot of our tourism, leisure and culture spend will occur over the summer period. And actually the first periods of monitoring reflects April and May's actuals and 10 months worth of forecasts. As we go through the year, there's a greater level of actuals in place and a lesser need for forecasting, which is the volatile area. So, but nevertheless, it seems quite for an accountant to say it, quite a positive result, even though it's a deficit. And I smile roundly at that, because we tend to be regarded as a rather dour group of individuals, but I will put the sense check there that I would fully anticipate that the month 7 position, which will be the next position that you'll see, where some of the savings targets and where officers have actually looked at the savings and the changes, etc., we normally would experience a dip in terms of a reality check for the situation then to drive to a better position at the end of the year. And that's actually captured in those sort of trends is captured in table 3.13. And probably as a change and in recognition, new members, what I've actually done in the main monitoring table is to give you last year's outturn as a comparison, so you can actually see the difference between the first period's monitoring activity this year and what last year's activity was as an outturn position. So if we look at the revenue position for economy and development specifically, that's captured in paragraph 3.1.7. So the directorate split over 3 main areas. It explains loosely what the overspends and contributory underspends are to derive the overall position for the directorate of being £180,000 overspent for enterprise. together with an underspend for public protection, because traditionally that's been regarded within the enterprise and development portfolio. I should say there's some juggling around senior officers' responsibilities that are going on at the moment that may very well mean that some of those things will get realigned through the year, but if so, I'll bring it to your attention in future monitoring reports. 3.2.6, one of the responsibilities of Select is to actually assess the progress around savings that members have previously subscribed to and how we're doing with that. There's a whole appendix there which is traffic lighted to show the risk attached to certain savings and where we are with it. You'll be pleased to know that as of month 2, the expectation in enterprise is that the savings targets that have been given to them will be achieved in full by the end of the year. And I've got no activity data that at this early stage would suggest other than that. Paragraph 3.3 is the capital position. Economy and development have a rather limited capital portfolio, 966,000. It largely relates to 4 or 5 initiatives. They are included in the monitoring reports, which are linked at the end of the report, but effectively they are the cattle market remedial works, the backstop purchase of Carwent House, the residual cost for the solar farm development, and a Section 106 scheme in terms of the Woodstock Way linkage scheme. Those are all on track, and generally what I find is that across the council, officers will be focusing largely on their revenue position, their new budgets, etc. at the start of the year, whilst they may also have a capital responsibility. When we ask questions around the forecasting, it's quite common for them to report that it'll be on track and it's only latter through the year, or as a result of weather commitments to the latter part of the year, that they start to experience slippage, which is why I will always remind them that incurring any capital works, particularly if it's outside works, try to program that into the first half of the financial year rather than the latter half, because you can't often influence the vagaries of the weather. Paragraph 3.36, whilst I've explained that economy and development only has a small portfolio, I will generally always remind members around how we're doing with our capital receipts generation, and it does have some bearing on the conversation you had earlier around housing, land, etc. But for new members, they may be interested to know that we have a future schools programme which involves the replacement of 2 secondary schools. That's the single biggest commitment this council has capital-wise for the next couple of years. That requires a generation of about £30 million worth of capital receipts. We don't actually need that in the bank at day one, because obviously the expenditure is spread over 5 years. But I increasingly highlight the risk that the receipts generation has a tendency to get pushed back in the programme, whereas the expenditure aspect generally stays on track. And that's why in the revenue monitoring that I suggest that I've incurred or anticipate an overspend in capital charges this year, because I think we will actually end up having to make some temporary borrowing by the end of the year to compensate for the fact that our expenditure levels exceed the capital receipts predictions. Okay, we then move on to the reserve section. The recommendation made to Cabinet is a reminder to them in 2.3 that our level of usable reserves is at a particular low ebb to facilitate any large-scale redevelopment and redesign of services. That's not through any profligate historic spending patterns. It's simply the fact that Monmouthshire has historically been... What's the best way of putting this? When it comes to RSG settlements with the government, we're regarded as being rather an affluent council that can stand on its own 2 feet, and our annual settlements tend to be the 20th, 21st or 22nd. So in comparison with a lot of other authorities in Wales, we don't actually have the reserve levels that others do. However, Welsh Government remind those authorities that in the current climate of austerity, they should not be sitting on large reserves either. So actually, whilst as an accountant I prefer ours to be a lot bigger, I do appreciate the likely reality. And obviously some of you may very well also hold a governorship. I do make reference in paragraph 3.4.4 around school reserves, and Cabinet were quite concerned about the unusual slip this year to a net deficit position combined for reserves, to the extent that they actually received a separate paper which will be going to CYP Select next week that explains the CYP's Directorate's response to that, and to reassure Cabinet and members generally that that is likely to be a short-term prospect rather than a long-term one. And at that point I'm happy to take any queries you might have, Chair.
Thank you, Mark, for that. Any questions, comments? Councillor Davis?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, my priority as a councillor, and I'm sure everybody else's here, is to maintain, not just maintain our services, but to make them more efficient than they are. And I regard this, that the operations of the council as a business, because that's the way I tend to look at things. Obviously, the financial pressures are likely to increase with time as the demand increases. One of the things which I keep harping on about, as Kelly is quite aware, is we need to make the best value of every penny that we've actually got coming in. Now, in my experience, one of the things that probably we need to look at very closely is the way our procurement, the way we buy things in, what services we get from people. Because in my experience, there is a massive amount of money that can be generated by taking a very close look at where we are spending our money. And then obviously what we save is going to be put into making those services better than they are now. I don't know what action you've taken on procurement, but I'm just suggesting to somebody who's experienced it that there is a massive amount of money to be saved there. I think we have to be careful, because certainly the company that I was involved in put some of these people under so much pressure that some of them were going out of business or on the verge of going out of business, and that's not what we are about. But we want to be charged a fair price, and we want to get value for money for the services that we are being provided with. And I think, you know, in our position, we set up a team specifically to look at that, and I think that's something that the council really wants to consider, because I would be amazed if there's not a massive amount of money that can be saved. But it won't happen unless you've actually got a team that is specifically looking at that. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, if I can start off, I'm sure that Mark wants to add something as well, Councillor. I think, again, you know, it's something that's struck me. About £91 million of our spend annually goes through procurement books in terms of outside supply contractors. That includes schools as well. And when you look at it, you do have to ask some questions. And it's not so much people are working in departments. I think sometimes it's the fact that we're caught in long-term contracts through things like the National Procurement Consortium. So one of the review pieces of work that we're doing under Future Monmouthshire at this time is around procurement. Not just traditional procurement, assuming we know the kinds of things we need to buy in and going through the same old processes. But sometimes we need to be sticking our problems out there and saying, look, this is the specific thing we need in Monmouthshire. We don't want to buy an off-the-shelf solution that everybody else does, that you'll tie us into for 10 years with annual uplifts. What is it that could be done differently that suits our needs, that's much more cost-effective? And we're starting to explore things like open data. So one of the things that we've done is we've put our external supplier information out every month. You may see it on our website. We put down everything we spend through our procurement books with external suppliers and contractors. Now, developers have got hold of that information. They've reorganised it. And it turns out now that our procurement spend locally is much lower and lesser than it's been in previous years. So from an economic development perspective, I want to do something about that, not just to save the council money, but to make sure that if our money is going anywhere, it's going to local companies and businesses and having that local impact that stays in our communities and drives enterprise. So I think the procurement stuff is really important in terms of efficiency and a mindset that we need to adopt. Just because we may spend money every year, you've still got to ask the question, is this absolutely necessary for us to continue to do? Is it the best deal? Are we being robust in contract management? But also there's the economic dimension. Are we impacting upon local firms and companies? And you may have all seen something silly that we did, Mark, myself and a few others, a couple of months ago around photocopying. And it was just, you know, very simple. Every time you press print, it's costing us, what was it, Mark? 370 odd grand a year? And that was equivalent to 17 people's jobs. You know, in this day and age when everything is digitised, but the issue about that photocopying was, if we had really robust contract management and we were on it every day, we would have noticed things like excess service charges that we'd paid. But actually, we need to sit up and say, well, why are we paying this? What is the problem here? Are people just pressing print, doing colour photocopying on these photocopiers, when actually, if you do need to photocopy anything, which I really would question in this day and age, you know, sometimes to get a lot with a local contractor is half the price of trying to do some of this stuff in-house. So it's small things, but small things add up, and it's the kind of thing we have to be cost conscious about.
Thank you, Kelly. I quite like the idea that my colleague here suggested about talking to councillors in a similar situation, because as you know, in business there's a lot of that goes on. You're talking to other people who are in the same position as you are, and I've never ever been anywhere on any plant, I'll talk about plants in my background, or spoken to anybody that I haven't learned something new that we could put into our business and make our business better. So I think it's important that we do look beyond Wales and we start talking to other authorities in a similar position and looking at what they are doing and adapting the best practice, because we want to be the best and remain the best and continue to improve. And if we don't talk to these people, we won't learn the things we should be learning.
I absolutely agree with that, councillor, but sometimes I think the last people we need to talk to are the councils. Sometimes in public service there's just too much public servicey type mindsets, and you know, I think a lot of what we're learning at the moment is actually from business and industry. So one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on in the future is the role of automation. You know, why do we, you know, with respect, have people in meetings typing up minutes when there are automated systems and processes? And it's not about, you know, what happens to that person then? Do we cut them adrift? They could be doing much higher value work that could be generating new opportunities and income. I'm sure Paula will say it's probably not the best use of time to write up minutes that are being live streamed anyway, then to go back to your desk and then to get them and to send them out. These things can be done in minutes with automated systems. And I think we've got to take a really comprehensive look. And lots of that learning will come from the private sector, because public sector isn't always an early adopter. No reason why we shouldn't be.
Did you want to come in, Mark? That's okay.
I might be providing a more candid perspective with this, but I mean, I think most people acknowledge that there are savings to be made from procurement, but I don't necessarily think we're best set up to realise them within Monmouthshire yet. I mean, if I give you, for instance, we do have a procurement section. It's one and a bit person, so it's probably a bit glamorous to call it a section, but it's largely attributed to property services, and actually a lot of their roles is making sure that the council don't fall foul of regional procurement requirements or national procurement requirements. I mean, I think actually if we could release the capacity to actually look at whether some of these national agreements are perhaps in our best interest, we might be able to derive better economies of scale. I mean, one anecdote I'd give you is that our utility cost is negotiated across Wales by the National Procurement Service. That's actually going up by between 15 and 20% this year, despite the fact that you would normally think, well, the more you're procuring, the better opportunity you have to drive a better rate. My personal utility costs aren't going up by 15 or 20%. I just feel that some of these businesses in dealing with the public sector have historically and traditionally regarded them as cash cows and can afford it, etc. We need to develop more of a, if you like, more of a cutthroat edge to some of this stuff that I don't think traditionally we're well gifted to achieve. So I think we probably are at something of a crossroads. I don't know how difficult it is to actually get out from some of these arrangements when and be perceived to be outside of the pack. There are some things that you want to be in the vanguard on, and there are some things that are right and proper to be nationally agreed. But it's certainly a very valid point, and I think increasingly having to make of the order of £4 to £5 million savings a year, it is certainly one that needs to be on the front of the council's radar.
I mean, that's why, to me, it says you need a team to look at it, because that team will pay for itself. No doubt about that. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Dovey.
Thank you, Chairman. What Alan says is absolutely right. The last position I held was doing exactly what he suggested, but I was doing it for a group of companies. They were about, there's about 20 of them, and this might sound a funny percentage, but they handled about 5% of the UK retail motor fuel. That is a huge chunk of money one way or another. And they found that they were not getting the right sort of deals. And I put a model together for them, and whereby they could go out to suppliers and work. They gave themselves a different name, and we negotiated with those suppliers on behalf of a whole range of things. So it came down to a central supply and negotiating base. I found the suppliers for them. I found the alternatives for them. And we used to have a committee that met, and these people had to give a presentation to the directors of this company, a selected board of directors of these companies. And the difference it made to them with their business was quite extraordinary. It was millions of pounds. So what Alan says is right. You do need somebody. You do need some specialised knowledge to be able to do it. But at the end of the day, it is worth making that investment to do, because they paid me a fair amount of money for what I was achieving for them year on year, and that was just by going to the market.
And again, I think it's a great point. And to give you some reassurance, in the new structure that the Chief Executive took through Cabinet a few weeks ago, there is a new post that's been established specifically to look at these redesign, these business opportunities. So I'm hopeful we'll recruit to that in the next couple of weeks. But the sole focus of that individual and the team that we cultivate around that individual will be to look at these things in the detail and the depth that we need, not just skirt over them and give us 1 year's saving and we'll think about it again in a few years when times are tough, but to make sure that we've got that depth and we've got that sort of continuing programme in place so we keep realising the benefits ongoing.
Councillor Figgins.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow up on those points then, can we take it as read then that there is an action to follow this meeting, that we will set up a unit to look at procurement or to look at moving away from those existing supply contracts? Is that already in process by the sounds of things? But just for clarity from my point of view, is it definitely going to happen?
I'm trying to do it as part of my general day job at the minute, which includes many different things, but we won't have the dedicated resources or the reserves even to have a dedicated unit just to look at procurement. It's probably one of about 20 different things that we need to look at. But the new post holder that hopefully we'll recruit to and secure will be able to mobilise some resource to have a whole programme of activity. So procurement will be one of the things that we look at, but we just don't have the luxury with the timeframes that we have and some of the challenging targets just to look at. We're probably going to need to have several work streams on this, on automation, democracy. I'm thinking about legal services. You know, there's a myriad of things that we're going to, and some of these things interlink, so it's good that we're able to look at them in the round. But we will have a unit that will be dedicated just to looking at these things, yes. If that helps.
Mark, do you want to add before I go back to Councillor Figgins?
Yeah, if I just offer you an opportunity here. I mean, the purpose of this report is for you to actually assess the budget monitoring of the council and Cabinet's approach to it. there is nothing stopping this select making or volunteering an observation to Cabinet around procurement and the sense of it. Councillor Murphy, when it comes to the budget round, I mean, he becomes rather apolitical. He will take a good idea in terms of resolving a budget process from anyone. But I often feel that sometimes it's a bit too late in the process when you look at it formally between October and January to be able to do that. So actually keeping it on the agenda now and making sure that we have a rolling programme of how these things are addressed, and actually the select can actually look then as to what Cabinet's response is and etc. is probably the most accountable way of dealing with it. I don't know what you think, Chair.
Chair, can I just say as well, because, you know, we have attracted some criticism in the past for having, you know, innovation teams and individuals, but what I would encourage this committee in the spirit of what Councillor Feekins has said to think about is research and development. Any good business invests a good proportion of its profit line in research and development. And I always think about businesses I know and how many people they have, you know, doing innovation, efficiency, new ways of working. And we employ a lot of people in this organisation to do finance and audit work, which is really important. But I don't think the number of people that we have working on, you know, issues such as you've raised is anywhere near the same. So as Mark has suggested, you know, it might be an important issue for you to think about and highlight. Maybe we need to have the future Monmouthshire session first so you can see the sort of breadth of all the things that we're trying to grapple with, and then maybe formulate some recommendations about the resources.
I think that's what I'm just.
Sorry
about,
to
no, I was
interject,
just going to suggest. I thought we could write to the cabinet member responsible now, or we could take it as a part of the whole future Monmouthshire package, and put forward a range of recommendations. Councillor Figgins, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, I think that. We should, at the back end of this meeting, write to the cabinet member and say to him that we need to set up an audit team. I'd mirror what councillors have already said, that team should be able to pay for itself. It will find savings immediately. I know I can earn more money sat in my office saving money than I can out there actually earning money. And that's the day and age that we live in. You know, you'll keep renewing contracts, you'll keep doing this, and you'll be saving money. And I think that we should find, even if we've got to take it out of reserves, to set up 2 or 3 people, or however many people it takes. Not saying that it can't fall in behind another committee above it, but we need to find those reserves. So, you know, we need to find that budget to make that happen. And the sooner we happen, the sooner we can start saving money. And it's a given that in absolute terms that unit will pay for itself hands down. And that's just echoing what's already been said to the floor to some people who've worked in that industry day in, day out. Spent a lifetime doing it. So I think that we should, at the back end of this, make that recommendation to council to do that, to cabinet to do that as soon as we can, and then let Kelly to bring that back into whichever heading that comes back in under at a later stage.
Is the rest of the committee mindful to do that? Are you happy to do that? Okay, we'll make that right.
Just one thing. I know we do it to some degree already, but I don't know to what degree. We're talking about expertise that's fine, and the economics of that. But we have a lot of expertise in the council ourselves. And I wonder, have we really looked at the total potential of to other businesses of some of the things that we do, the expertise we have, or the facilities we have? Even you could be looking at training in certain areas. So we should be not only looking at what we're prepared to pay for, we should be looking at what we're prepared to sell, where we think there's the opportunity. I know you've been on board with that already, Kelly, to a degree, but for the benefit of the new guys here, I'd just like to raise that as a point. That's something we should be doing as well.
I think it's a really important and a positive point. You know, we do have marketable skills, and you know, we have tried to sell those out over previous years, whether it's through training or, you know, some of the specialisms that we have in highways or environmental health, where we've taken on contracts on behalf of big businesses, for example. I think the problem is now, you know, in my position, I've probably lost nearly 1/3 of my budget over, if not more, over the last 5 years, which has been significant. You know, we have taken the brunt of the cuts, and we've managed that well because we've still been able to generate quite steady sources of income. But I think we really are at the point now, and Paul sometimes uses the phrase sort of ragged edge of competence, where they really, so if you take economic development, we've got 2 core funded members of staff. And that's not an excuse, and it's not me bleating, because, you can always make something of a crisis, can't you? There's always opportunity, it forces you to do things differently. So in many ways, I think it's been a good thing. But I think now if we really are going to tackle some of the big problems, it needs a boost of additional resource. And that resource is probably not, we do have capacity in our organisation in terms of the thought leadership and the capability. But, the capacity in terms of, human beings to do it is a different thing. And this stuff is a skill set. It's not as much an audit skill set or just a straightforward accountancy skill set. It is understanding that ability to look at new ways of working, radical efficiency, how to rapidly prototype. If you're going to fail, you need to fail quickly and then move on. There is a mindset and there is a design process that we need to adopt to do these things as successfully as we can, noting if we get it right, there will be some failure, because the failure will be key to relearning.
Councillor Fegand?
Just to come back on one very quick point then, I agree with you 100%, Kelly. It's mindset. It's all about mindset, and it's about changing that. We've got some fantastic minds here in the committee who've done this day in, day out, and they know where they walk that path. Maybe we should suggest, I don't know if that's the right way to go about it, but suggest to the cabinet member that we set up a working group between members as well at the beginning of that process, just so that we can tease out any of that information. And if we've got that experience sat on within the membership, then it would make sense to try and harness that as best we can, rather than just letting it become, rather than just handing over that responsibility to Kelly and say, here you are, we'd like you to run with this, please, because I don't think that would be very fair and probably doesn't make best use of members' ability.
Chair, if I may, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about around future Monmouthshire is we have teams and departments in to do what I call challenge sessions. So we take a look at the data, we take a look at unit costs, we take a look at practice, we take a look at the extent to which those departments are engaging in foresight and knowing what's coming, what kind of skills, trends are out there in the marketplace. And that works okay, but we do it as officers at the minute. And I would like to open up that process to members, to business, to the community, and just to get some fresh thinking and perspectives. And I'm not saying it's chummy as officers, but you tend to know what you know. I want to know about the things we don't know, and I think the best way of doing that is opening up that dialogue and conversation. So that may be something that you want maybe to consider.
Yeah, I think again, I don't want to preempt what's going to come out of the workshop session, but I think it probably will be another recommendation that will be generated. I'm certainly more than happy now to write to the cabinet member responsible for Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Fegan took the words right out of my mouth, actually. I mean, there's a lot of experience here. Certainly I'm willing to help, and I'm sure most other people are as well. And I think, Kelly, you'll be aware, in business, it's not just about setting up a team, it's about the team having a plan, do, check, act. And I think we as a group are in a position where we can have a positive input, but we can also monitor and suggest things that perhaps people are not quite moving in the right direction. And it's about driving these initiatives, isn't it? Just saying that we're going to do it isn't good enough. These people have got to be reporting back, and we've got to be questioning them and asking them, are they going in the right direction, without putting too much pressure on people. But so, we need to keep, it's going to be a continuous improvement we're looking at, not just a one-off action that is going to solve everything. Thank you.
Yes, Mark.
And to be honest, that sense of direction as a council, I mean, you'll appreciate that the single biggest cost of any council is largely its staffing. In managing the savings agenda for the last 5 or 6 years, it's largely staffing that's resulted, but we're all fairly proud of the fact that actually most of the electorate out there and most of the services are still being delivered to a similar extent. From an outward-facing point of view, there's very little that you can see, but it does require officers behind the scenes working harder and longer. So actually some direction from members as to what the priorities are in terms of using our energies most efficiently would probably be quite welcome, wouldn't it?
Okay, any other further comments? Councillor Becker?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what we've just been talking about, I'm kind of amazed that there isn't a sort of proactive team dealing with that already. I mean, you know, when you're facing the kind of cuts that you faced, where have you found them already? So, yeah, I'm all for it. Let's write to the member, certainly. As a slight difference, though, changing topic, you alluded to another report that's being delivered on the schools deficit situation. Who does that report go to? Can we get a look at it?
It has gone to Cabinet yesterday, so it's already in a public agenda if you have access to those papers, and it will go to CYP Select next Thursday for a, if you like, a sounding board or a more practical analysis of it.
Okay, any other comments, questions? Councillor Roden? Yep.
Thank you, Chair. I'm being fairly fresh into the council. I'm not really au fait with the feel of the accounts yet. Are there areas where you actually have forecasts that are usually incorrect, and why? Thank you.
No pressure, Mark.
No, I'm infallible. No, I think the reality is that when you're dealing with £143 million worth of net expenditure, which is the equivalent of a 300 odd million gross expenditure, there are always going to be variations. Some of those areas, well, let's call a spade a spade. There are certain service managers that have a greater confidence around their business acumen and their business responsibility to accept their forecast. There are others whereby I will challenge and make myself unpopular with testing those assumptions out and try to interfere constructively to improve a situation. But the monitoring is a management tool. At any one point in time, I often use it with SLT and SMT, and they may regard I might beat them over the head with it occasionally to change practices and change approach. So one of the shortcomings of perhaps the audit report on budget management was that they expected the monitoring at Q1 to be the same as outturn, and when it wasn't, they said, well, there must be deficiencies in process. Actually, that's a catalyst to changing practices, etc. So it will always change. There are some services which are inherently more difficult to forecast, things like, well, particularly around things like social care, because the sizes of some of those individual care packages, whether it be children's or parents, can be quite excessive, and actually very small changes in numbers can have quite a big effect on the bottom line, which is why we do the regular monitoring. And whilst you will see it periodically, there is also interim monitoring done with directorate management teams to oil those practices and changes so that there are no surprises, if you like. I mean, last year we were, I think it was £800,000 surplus at the end of the year. I thought it was the first year I was actually going to miss that surplus mark, because every year it gets inherently harder. You might think, well, gosh, 800,000, you've been pulling the wool over our eyes about how doom and gloom this is for us, but on a £143 million budget, that's probably less than a 0.01% variation. I mean, I've described it to other people in terms of trying to manage the budget for a council involving perhaps 250 plus service managers. It's a bit like managing your bank account, but giving your chequebook away to your neighbours, and then expecting this year's bank balance to be exactly the same as next year. There is quite a lot of corralling, herding, and cajoling people to get to the bottom end. So I don't know whether I'm giving you a politician's answer there, but there's a lot of work being done in the background to try to substantiate certain areas of the monitoring. And as I said in my preamble, I'm always more pleased once I've got through the summer period, because quite a lot of our activity is seasonal in nature.
Thank you. That was a very good straight bat response, I think. Just to put it into context, in my own company, we I think we're 15% out. That's on our profits, which is very good. And I expected certain areas like children's services to have quite a variability anyway. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, any other further comment and question? So we've got that action to write to the cabinet member responsible and recommend that they find additional appropriate investment to develop I suppose what would be a procurement, development and efficiency team to try and find those valued savings over the next few years. The letter will be drafted, we'll circulate it amongst colleagues for sign off over the next week or so. So, okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark. So, agenda item 7. So is the list of actions arising from our previous meeting. I'm sure you've all seen that list. I think Paula, do you want to say anything? I think it's all been done.
Yeah, I think with the actions, most of those have been covered and you've had the responses. Do you want to go?
I was just going to ask, maybe
Yeah, a lot of the actions have been covered and I'm sure you've had the answers. A majority of them tie into our forward work programme, which we have. Obviously, as Kelly's discussed today, we've got the Future Mom workshop on the 17th of October at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's going to be led by E&D with all members invited, so I really would encourage you to attend and encourage your sort of party members to attend, because I think it's going to be a really valuable session. I know Kelly and the other senior officers are very enthusiastic about it. Something that you've asked for was regarding the cross-border scrutiny. Contact has been made with Gloucester and Bristol. The way they're looking at things is slightly different. They don't tend to have scrutiny meetings as such. They tend to go down the task and finish group route, which is not always very successful when we've tried it here. They obviously have their own ideas of what they want to discuss, so we'll meet with them prior to you meeting with them. So obviously we know where there's common ground, and we'll have some feedback from yourselves as to what you feel needs to be discussed with the bordering councils. The work programme is very much a moving document, and next month we've got tourism and we've got the supplementary planning tourism guidance, which always comes to E&D, and that brings Mark Hand back, and the annual planning report. So you've had the policy report this morning, you'll now have the planning report in October, so that's always an interesting document. I'm sorry, Councillor Davis, I think it's going to be a big agenda again, so you'll probably be, forewarned is forearmed and all that. But coming out of today's meeting, I've spoken to Mark Hand regarding how we were talking about education contributions and how we look at capacity, and he's really interested in bringing that back to the committee. There's a new guidance note on 106 funding and where we seek it and how we can calculate that. So that's something they need to sort of a bit of political buy-in on. The question is whether we bring it to E&D as a meeting or we do it as a seminar proper, because it's going to be quite an involved item. So it's entirely up to you. If you want to bring it along and tag it onto your agenda, you're more than welcome to do it. But if you'd like to do a standalone seminar, that might be an idea. Because when I said to Mark, how long will you need? He said, I need 3 days. So that's a bit of an idea. So he's sort of looking at October or November. So would you rather keep it with obviously we would invite all members. Would you rather keep it with a meeting, or would you rather sort of a separate seminar? Yeah. So perhaps have like an E&D meeting in the morning, break for lunch, perhaps do the seminar in the afternoon if we can get the dates to work. Yeah. Brilliant. Excellent. There you go.
Thank you very much. Any other comment about the work programme? Or straightforward? The future Monmouthshire workshop session is probably the most important. Not just for us but for the whole county. So please try and get here if you can. You've seen the council and Cabinet Business Forward programme attached as well. No other surprises there, I don't think. So other than that workshop on the 17th of October, our next scheduled meeting is Thursday the 19th of October at 10. So thank you ever so much for your contributions today, councillors. Thank you, officers, and see you next time. Thank you.